The night Agnes Whitmore walked into the Thornridge ballroom, she was not supposed to be seen. She had spent 7 years learning how to move through that house without disturbing the air. Through the kitchen, along the servants' corridor, into the still room where she kept her dried herbs in labeled rows. She knew which floorboard creaked outside the morning room. She knew to set her bag down quietly when the housekeeper was resting. She had made herself, in that house, as necessary and as invisible as the lamps. But tonight the lamps were burning 300 candles, and Lady Serena Hale was standing at the center of the room in ivory silk. And Edmund Calloway, Duke of Thornridge, 31 years old, the man Agnes had loved since she was 19, was raising a champagne glass in a toast that would seal his engagement before the entire county. Agnes was wearing blue wool and her mother's garnet pin. She had come through the servants' entrance, as she always did. She had told herself she came for the music. She had lied to herself, and she knew it. And she stood in the doorway, with the cold October air still on her shoulders, and watched Edmund's face as he looked at Serena. And the discipline that had held her silent for 7 years simply gave way. The way a joint gives way when it has been asked to bear too much for too long. She stepped forward. Not to the center, halfway. Into the light. Her voice carried the way it carried in a sick room, trained to cut through noise and panic and reach the person who needed to hear it clearly. I loved you for 7 years. The room went silent. 300 candles, 200 guests. The clink of a champagne glass set down with controlled force somewhere to her left. Edmund turned. His hand still held Serena's. He looked at Agnes. Blue wool, garnet pin, the woman who had sat at his kitchen table and corrected his Latin and argued about drainage and saved his tenants' children and never once walked through his front door. I know, he said. 2 words. Serena's fingers in his eyes on Agnes. He knew. He had always known. And he had chosen the woman who did not require him to fight. Agnes nodded. Once. The precise, controlled nod of a woman who had expected this answer because she had decided 7 years ago that this was the only answer possible. Then I was right not to ask. She turned. She walked out. Not through the servants' entrance, not through the corridor where she had spent 7 years learning to disappear. She walked through the front door, the first time she had ever used it. The October air hit her face, and she kept walking, and behind her she heard Serena's voice, low and careful, asking Edmund a question. Who is she? Edmund was looking at the front door, the one Agnes had never used. The one she had just walked through for the first and last time. She is... He stopped. He stood there, Serena's hand in his, 300 guests watching him, and he did not have a word. Friend was wrong. Healer was incomplete. Companion covered the surface of 7 years and left everything beneath it in unnamed. He stood in the center of his own ballroom, and could not produce a single word for the woman who had just walked out of his house through the front door. And the silence where the word should have been was more honest than anything he had said all evening. Serena read his face. Her fingers loosened around his, not quite a release, more like a question she had not yet decided to ask aloud. Agnes was at her father's cottage by 10:30. Not her own rooms. She had rented 2 rooms above the chandler's shop since her father died 3 years ago. But the cottage where she had grown up, which still held his instruments, his ledgers, his dried specimen jars lined along the window shelf. She had a key. She had been meaning to clear the place for months. Tonight she began. She pulled the medical trunk from under the bed and started packing. Bone saw wrapped in oilcloth, forceps in their leather roll, the glass-stoppered bottles of tincture she had mixed herself and stored here because the cottage had a north-facing window, and tinctures kept better away from sun. She worked steadily, without pausing to think, because thinking meant replaying Edmund's face when he turned and saw her. And she was not ready to do that yet. She was wrapping the stethoscope, her father's best, a French model he had saved 3 months to purchase. When Mr. Garrick knocked, she heard his horse first, then his boots on the path. He was a large man, Garrick, broad across the shoulders with a steward's permanent frown. And he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say, and already knew it would not go smoothly. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Garrick? Agnes did not look up from the stethoscope. I am not at home to Thornridge business tonight. It's not Thornridge business. Garrick turned his hat twice in his hands. It's Mrs. Hadley's youngest, Eliza. She's had a fever since this afternoon, and it's climbing. Mrs. Hadley sent to the coaching inn for the London physician, and he's not expected until Thursday. Agnes set the stethoscope down. Find someone else? Miss Whitmore, there is a surgeon in Wycombe. Send a rider. The surgeon in Wycombe set a man's arm wrong last spring, and the arm had to come off. Garrick's voice was flat, not unkind, but carrying no room for negotiation. You are the best healer in this county. You know it, and I know it, and Mrs. Hadley knows it. The girl is 8 years old, and her temperature was 102 when I left. Agnes looked at the half-packed trunk, at the stethoscope in her hands, at the wall where her father had hung his degree certificate. The paper now yellowed at the edges, the ink still dark. I made a spectacle of myself at his ball tonight, she said. The whole county will be talking by morning. The whole county can talk about whatever it likes, Garrick said. I am talking about an 8-year-old girl with a climbing fever. Are you a healer, or aren't you? The question landed exactly where he had aimed it. Agnes had asked herself that question before, in the middle of the night, with a patient seizing, when fear tried to convince her that she was only a woman with a bag of herbs and no license to practice. She had always answered it the same way her father had taught her to answer it, by picking up the bag. She set the stethoscope aside, not in the trunk, but on the shelf. She picked up her medical bag. She checked it: willow bark, fever powder, the small thermometer, the cloth for cold compresses, and walked past Garrick into the night. She did not go back to finish packing. Not that night. The morning room at Thornridge was a room designed for comfortable conversations, with pale yellow walls and a fire that burned even in October. It did not look like the kind of room where a man's future was decided for him. Edmund sat in the chair by the window and watched Earl Hale take the chair across from him with the unhurried confidence of a man who had decided the conversation's outcome before he arrived. Hale was not a cruel man. Edmund had always respected that about him. The Earl was direct, pragmatic, and operated on a clear calculation of interests. He poured his own coffee without waiting to be served, which was either a democratic gesture or a statement that he intended to be at ease. And then he looked at Edmund with the steady, patient expression of a man waiting for a younger man to understand something obvious. My daughter's reputation, Hale said, is publicly attached to yours. The announcement was made before the county last night. Her name was in 3 conversations before I left the room. He set down his cup. If you withdraw now, you damage her prospects and you damage our arrangement. I expect the wedding to proceed. Edmund looked at the fire. He was aware of the precise nature of what Hale had just said. Not a threat, not a plea, but a statement of fact delivered with the confidence of a man who had never needed to threaten, because reality had always arranged itself in his favor. I understand, he said. Hale nodded. He finished his coffee. He left. Edmund sat in the yellow morning room for a long time after, and at no point did he produce a reason why the wedding should not proceed. That was stronger than the reasons why it should. Political necessity, Serena's reputation. The Canal Commission vote in March, which required Hale's support and which would bring employment to 300 men in the county. His aunt's borough seats. The smooth, well-lit path that Serena represented, a path he had chosen with open eyes. He was still sitting there when Garrick came in at noon. "Miss Whitmore has signed a lease," Garrick said without preamble. He set a paper on the desk, not a report, just a note he had written to himself, the habit of a steward who documented everything. The vacant shop on Church Street. She's calling it the Whitmore Dispensary. She wrote to a London supplier last week for stock. She'll be open before the month is out. Edmund looked at the note. Church Street. The vacant shop that had been a chandler's before the chandler moved to Wycombe. A narrow building with a good front window and a room behind for mixing. Agnes had opened her own front door. He set the note down without speaking. Garrick waited a moment, then left. And Edmund sat alone in the room where Agnes used to correct his Latin at the long table by the south window, where she had once spent 40 minutes arguing that rosemary in the estate herb garden was being planted too close to the lavender and would lose its medicinal potency. And he had argued back for the pleasure of hearing her argue. And she had been right, which she always was, and the rosemary had been moved. And neither of them had ever spoken about the fact that it was the best 40 minutes of his week. He sat in that room for a long time, and the fire burned down, and he did not call for Garrick to rebuild it. The Whitmore Dispensary opened on a Tuesday, which Agnes chose deliberately because Tuesday was market day and half the village would walk past Church Street on their way to the square. She had the window dressed by 8 in the morning. The dried herb bundles hanging from the beam, the labeled jars on the shelf behind the counter, the small slate board outside with the week's available preparations listed in her own clear hand. The first patient arrived at 9. Mrs. Hadley bringing Eliza, whose fever had broken Sunday morning after 2 nights of cold compresses and Agnes's willow bark preparation, to say thank you and to purchase a jar of the elderflower syrup that kept Eliza's winter coughs manageable. "Thomas has a cough already?" Mrs. Hadley said, examining the shelf with the practiced eye of a woman who had been treating her children's ailments for 15 years. "The dry kind. Comes on at night." "Honey and thyme with a little dried ginger," Agnes said. "I'll mix it fresh. Bring him by Thursday." By the end of the first week, she had seen 14 patients, written 12 entries in the practice ledger in her own name, and earned £4 and 11 shillings that had no connection to Thornridge. She ordered a second shipment from the London supplier, dried valerian root, oil of cloves, a bolt of the fine muslin she used for poultice wrapping, and signed the order in the name she had put on the door. Mr. Garrick came in on Friday with his shoulder, which had been troubling him since August, and which he had been managing with a posture that everyone on the estate had noticed and no one had mentioned. He stood in the doorway of the dispensary for a moment, hat in hand, looking at the jars on the shelf with the expression of a man taking stock of a situation he had helped create. "The shoulder," Agnes said, without looking up from the ledger. "The shoulder," Garrick confirmed, and sat down on the stool beside the counter. She mixed the poultice herself. Comfrey root, arnica, a small addition of capsicum that she warned him would burn before it eased, and applied it while he sat very still and looked at the wall with the expression of a man enduring something he deserved. "The dispensary suits you," he said when she was tying off the bandage. "It does," Agnes agreed. His Grace asked after the fever cases, whether they had all recovered. Agnes tied the last knot. "They have. Mrs. Hadley's Eliza is well. The other 2 children I saw last week are improving. He'll be glad to hear it. He can be glad, Agnes said, and handed Garrick the jar of remaining poultice for home application, and moved to the next entry in the ledger. Lady Calloway arrived the following Wednesday. She came in a carriage, which was unnecessary for Church Street, and she wore the expression of a woman performing a charitable visit to a slightly inferior establishment. She was Edmund's aunt, his father's sister, a widow of considerable property, and 3 borough votes that she held with the careful attention of a woman who understood political currency. She looked at the jars on the shelf. She looked at Agnes's apron. She looked at the ledger. "You are the herbalist," Lady Calloway said. "I am the physician's daughter," Agnes replied. "My father was Dr. Thomas Whitmore. He practiced in this village for 30 years. You do not hold a medical license?" "No, I hold a lease." Agnes moved behind the counter and began measuring dried chamomile into a paper packet. "I understand you have been having headaches, Lady Calloway. Mrs. Garrick mentioned it. The kind that begin behind the left eye and spread toward the crown." Lady Calloway's expression shifted slightly. "I did not come here to discuss my headaches." "You came to assess me," Agnes said. "I understand. You're welcome to do so. While you're here, your tenant Mrs. Bartlett has been unable to walk for 2 months. You told her the gout was a condition of age and she should endure it. I told her to soak her feet in willow bark water twice daily and reduce the port wine to 1 glass at Sunday dinner. She walked to church last week for the first time since August." What followed was the particular silence of a woman reconsidering her position without being willing to show that she is reconsidering it. "I will take the headache tisane," Lady Calloway said finally. Agnes made it up without comment. Rosemary, feverfew, a small measure of dried lavender, and wrapped it in the blue paper she used for all her preparations. She named the price. Lady Calloway paid it. She left without another word. She came back the following week. She did not mention Mrs. Bartlett, and Agnes did not raise the subject. She purchased the tisane and left, and Agnes recorded the sale in the ledger, and neither of them acknowledged that something had been settled between them. The fever arrived without warning, the way serious illness always does, not gradually, but all at once, in 3 households within 2 days. The Hadley family first. Young Thomas, who had been coughing since Tuesday, woke Thursday with a rash along his neck and a temperature that Mrs. Hadley recognized with a particular dread of a woman who had seen scarlet fever before. By Friday afternoon, 2 more families on the eastern edge of the Thornridge estate had children showing the same signs. Garrick saddled his horse at 10 o'clock at night. He rode 12 miles to Church Street, knocked on the dispensary door until the light appeared upstairs, and waited in the cold with his breath making clouds in the dark. Agnes came down in her working clothes, her hair pinned back, her bag already in her hand, because she had heard the urgency in the knock. "Scarlet fever," Garrick said. 3 families, 5 children between them. The London physician is 2 days away at the earliest. Agnes looked at him. She looked at the dispensary behind her. The jars she had labeled, the ledger she had signed, the practice she had built from nothing in 3 weeks. She thought about the kitchen door at Thornridge, the one she had used for 7 years and sworn never to use again. "I am coming for the children," she said, "not for him." "I know," said Garrick. "I didn't ask for any other reason." She came. The Thornridge sick room was a large room on the ground floor, normally used for storage, which the housekeeper had converted with the efficiency of a woman who had managed crises before. Agnes walked in, set her bag on the work table, and took stock. 5 children, varying severity, 2 already at the rash stage, and 3 still in the earlier phase with the characteristic strawberry tongue and the high, climbing temperature. She called dosages from memory. The willow bark preparation for fever reduction, the honey and thyme syrup for the throat, the diluted tincture of golden seal that her father had used in severe cases, and which she had prepared herself from dried root she kept in the dispensary. She organized the mothers into shifts. She showed the housekeeper how to mix the cold compresses and at what temperature the water should be kept. She did not look for Edmund. Edmund found her at 2 a.m, sitting beside the Hadley boy. Thomas, 8 years old, the one with the dry cough, the one she had told Mrs. Hadley to bring by on Thursday. He had been the mildest case when she arrived and had become the worst by midnight, his temperature spiking, his small body beginning the rhythmic shaking that Agnes recognized with the flat, controlled attention of a healer who has seen this before and knows exactly what it means. She held his wrist, counted, watched his chest. When the shaking intensified, she moved the lamp closer, adjusted the compress on his forehead, spoke to him in the low, continuous voice she had learned from her father. Not words exactly, just sound. The reassurance of another person's presence in the dark. Edmund stood in the doorway and watched. He had seen Agnes at work before, at the kitchen table, mixing preparations, explaining dosages to the housekeeper. He had seen her competence the way you see a familiar piece of furniture. Present, useful, part of the room. What he saw now was different. Her hands did not shake. The boy was seizing, and her hands were steady, and her voice was level, and she was making decisions. Specific, consequential decisions about a child's life. From a place of knowledge so complete, it did not require thought. He did not go in. He stood in the doorway and watched, and at some point during the second hour, he moved to the chair beside the work table and repositioned it, quietly, without drawing attention, so that it was behind Agnes rather than across the room. He said nothing. She did not look up. When she finally sat 2 hours later, the chair was there. She did not look to see who had moved it. She sat and closed her eyes for 10 minutes, and then stood and went back to the boy. The fever broke at dawn. Dr. Fenton arrived from London the following afternoon, brisk and self-important in the way of men who have been sent for urgently and wish to establish immediately that they have arrived. He examined the children one by one, checked the preparations Agnes had mixed, reviewed the dosage notes she had written in the margins of the household ledger, and asked the question with the tone of a man who expects to be surprised by the answer. Who managed the treatment? Miss Whitmore, Garrick said from the doorway. Fenton looked at Agnes. Your training? My father, Agnes said. Dr. Thomas Whitmore. He practiced in Hartfield for 30 years. Fenton looked at the dosage notes again. He looked at the tincture bottles, each labeled in Agnes's hand with the preparation date and the concentration. He made the sound of a man revising an assumption he had not known he was holding. Your father trained you better than most men at Edinburgh, Fenton said. The golden seal dosage in particular, I would not have trusted it to half the physicians I know. Edmund was standing in the doorway when Fenton said it. Agnes did not look at him. Fenton moved on to the next examination. Edmund remained where he was for a long moment. And then he walked into the corridor, and he did not move for a long time after. The Hadley boy's fever was gone by the second morning. Agnes was in the corridor outside the sick room, leaning against the wall with her eyes closed and her hands loose at her sides. The posture of a woman who has been awake for 20 hours and has run out of ways to hold herself upright. Edmund came down the corridor with a glass of water. He held it out. She took it without opening her eyes. Then she opened them because she could hear that he was still there. You are staring, she said. I am seeing you, Edmund said. It is not the same as staring. Agnes drank the water. set the glass on the hall table. You have seen me for 7 years. I have watched you for 7 years. He was looking at her with the particular attention of a man who has stopped managing what he allows himself to notice. Watching is not the same as seeing. I am learning the difference. Learning is slow for you. It is, he said. The sick room is helping. She looked at him, the careful, assessing look she gave patients when she was deciding whether the crisis had passed or simply paused. Whatever she found, she did not speak it aloud. She pushed off the wall, picked up her bag, and went back in to check on Thomas Hadley. Edmund stood in the corridor with the empty glass in his hand. Serena came to the dispensary on a Tuesday, which Agnes noticed because it was market day, and Serena could not have chosen a more public moment if she had tried. She came alone. No maid, no carriage waiting at the door. In a dark green walking dress that was considerably finer than anything else on Church Street. And she stood at the counter with the composure of a woman who has rehearsed this conversation and intends to have it regardless of how uncomfortable it becomes. He chose me, Serena said. I know you loved him. I am not asking you to pretend otherwise, but he chose me. Am I supposed to feel guilty for that? Agnes looked at her. Serena was 22, and not what Agnes had expected, not triumphant, not cruel, but genuinely bewildered, the way a person is bewildered when they have followed all the rules correctly, and the world has still produced a mess. No, Agnes said. He chose you because choosing you was the easier path. That is not your fault. Then why didn't you say something? Serena asked. You had 7 years. 7 years of kitchen tables and herb gardens and arguments about, what was it, rosemary? You had 7 years and you never once told him. Agnes set down the jar she was holding. She looked at the dispensary, her name on the door, her ledger on the counter, and then she looked at Serena, and she said the things she had not said to anyone, including herself, since the night of the ball. At 19, I decided that a physician's daughter does not compete with an earl's daughter for a duke. I called it dignity. Serena's expression did not soften exactly, but it changed, the bewilderment sharpening into something more like recognition. Was it? The question was fair. Agnes had known, somewhere beneath the years of professional distance and careful silence, that it was fair. She had simply never been in a room with someone willing to ask it. I thought so, Agnes said. I think now it was fear dressed as principle. I was afraid that if I asked him directly, the answer would be no. And I preferred the uncertainty to the rejection. I called the uncertainty dignity because that sounded better than cowardice. Serena was quiet for a moment. She picked up a small jar from the counter, the dried lavender, which Agnes kept there because the smell settled people who came in anxious, and turned it in her hands. He is the same, Serena said finally. He chose me because choosing me did not require him to be afraid of anything. He never argued with me about rosemary. He never argued with me about anything at all. She set the jar down. I used to think that was because we were well suited. I understand now that it was because he was not paying attention. Agnes looked at her. This young woman who had won the thing Agnes had refused to compete for, and who had arrived at the dispensary not to gloat, but to understand. You deserved better than that, Agnes said. I did, Serena agreed. She picked up her gloves from the counter. So did you. She paused at the door. The fear in him and the fear in you are the same thing, Miss Whitmore. You just wore it differently. She left. The bell above the dispensary door rang once and was still. Agnes stood at the counter for a long time. She had built a wall 7 years ago and called it wisdom. And Serena, 22 years old, arriving on market day with the courage to ask a fair question, had just shown her exactly what the wall had been made of. That night, after closing, Edmund knocked. She heard his knock and knew it. She had heard him knock at the kitchen door of Thornridge often enough to recognize the rhythm. She crossed the dispensary in the dark, the familiar smell of rosemary and dried herbs around her, and opened the door. He came in. She stepped back. They stood on opposite sides of the counter, her workspace, her territory, the practice she had built without him. And neither of them spoke for a moment. "Serena came today," Agnes said. "I know. She told me." Edmund looked at the jars on the shelf, the labeled rose, the ledger open on the counter. "She asked me why I never argued with her. I told her I did not have a reason to argue. She was always agreeable. She told me that was the problem." Agnes said nothing. "I broke the engagement this afternoon," Edmund said. "I told her the truth. She asked if it was you. I said yes. She said she had known from the first dinner that I argued with you about Rosemary for 40 minutes and had never argued with her about anything." He paused. "She said she deserved a man who argued with her. She's right about that." Agnes looked at the counter between them. 7 years of shared evenings and kitchen tables and arguments about botany, separated by 2 feet of oak and every assumption she had made at 19 and called wisdom. Edmund leaned forward slowly. He placed his forehead against hers. Agnes felt the warmth of it, the specific, particular warmth of a person who has been close to you for years and is finally, for the first time, actually touching you. She put one hand flat on the counter. He placed his over it. They stood there, foreheads together, hands layered on the oak between them, breathing in an apothecary that smelled like rosemary, and the beginning of something neither of them had a word for yet. Earl Hale withdrew from the Canal Commission. Edmund said quietly, against her temple. "I know," she said. "Lady Calloway wrote yesterday. She is withdrawing her borough support." "I know," she said again. "I read both letters," Edmund said. "I set them down. I did not call for Garrick." Agnes lifted her head. She looked at him, the man who had sat at her father's kitchen table and let her correct his Latin, and watched her save his tenants' children and spent 7 years calling what he felt by the wrong name. She stepped back. She picked up the lamp. "Come back in daylight," she said. "Through the front door." Edmund straightened. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw in his face that he understood exactly what she was asking. He said quietly, "Yes," and left. 6 weeks after the ball. Dusk, the light going amber over the herb garden behind the dispensary, the rosemary bed still green against the October soil. Agnes was cutting the last of the season's growth, not for drying, just for the occupation of her hands. When she heard the bell above the front door of the dispensary ring, she heard him come through the shop and out the back door into the garden. She did not turn around. "You came through the front," she said. "I have been entering through the wrong door for 7 years," Edmund said. Agnes turned then. He was standing at the edge of the garden in the day's last light, in daylight, where anyone walking past on Church Street could see the Duke of Thornridge standing in a healer's herb garden. "Why are you here, Edmund?" "Because Dr. Fenton told me your tincture for the Hadley boy was the most precise dosage he has seen outside a teaching hospital," Edmund said. "Because Garrick rode 12 miles in the dark to find you and did not consider anyone else. Because I stood in that doorway and watched you hold a seizing child and your hands did not shake. And I understood, standing there, watching you, that I have spent 7 years sitting beside the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I called it friendship because calling it love meant fighting for it." Agnes looked at him. She pulled a sprig of rosemary from the bed beside her. crushed it between her fingers. The scent rose between them, sharp and clean, the smell that had been present at every argument, every late evening, every moment across 7 years when she had known what she felt and chosen silence. "That is a fine speech," she said. "You are good at speeches. You made one at the ball when you toasted Serena." "Agnes, no." Her voice was steady, the way it was steady in a sick room, trained and deliberate. "You will hear me now. I loved you for 7 years. I came to your house through the kitchen door. I treated your tenants' children and your housekeeper's rheumatism and your own fever 2 winters ago when you were too stubborn to rest. I sat at your table and argued with you about comfrey and drainage, and whether Hartfield needed a proper dispensary. And I never told you what I felt. Because I decided, at 19, that a physician's daughter does not ask a duke to love her. I called it dignity. Serena called it something else. She may be right." "She is right," Edmund said. "Do not agree with her to flatter me." "I am not flattering you." He took a step into the garden. "You were wrong, Agnes. You decided I would reject you without giving me the chance. You built a wall and called it wisdom, and I never climbed it because climbing it would have cost me something. My aunt's approval, Hale's support, the county's good opinion. You were wrong to build the wall. I was wrong not to climb it. We were both cowards. Different kinds. Same result." Agnes was quiet. The rosemary was still in her hands, the scent of it everywhere. He was right. She had known he was right, from the moment Serena asked her the fair question in this very shop. Had known it and been carrying it since. The weight of an assumption that had hardened into identity over 7 years. "We are both fools," she said. "Yes," he said. "Different kinds. Same result." She looked at him, and then she looked at the dispensary behind her, the jars she had labeled, the patient's ledger, the practice she had rebuilt from nothing after the ball. She looked at what she had made without him. "I built this," she said, "after the ball, without you. I signed a lease. I ordered stock from London. I treated Mrs. Hadley's children and Mr. Garrick's shoulder and Lady Calloway's headaches, and I did it with my name on the door and my own money in the ledger. I am not coming back to Thornridge as someone you rescued." "I am not rescuing you," Edmund said. "I am asking to be part of what you built." Agnes looked at him. The distinction mattered. She let it settle. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to walk through your front door," Edmund said. "Every day, in daylight, where anyone can see." He held her gaze. "I know what it costs. Lady Calloway's votes, the Canal Commission. My aunt will not attend the wedding. The list is real. Every item on it is real. And not one item on that list equals the sound of your voice arguing with me about comfrey at 3 in the morning while my fever broke. That is sentimental. It is the truth. I have been rational for 7 years. Rational chose Serena. Rational was wrong." Agnes looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You said 'I know' at the ball," while holding her hand. "What did you know?" Edmund did not look away. "That you loved me. That I loved you. That I was choosing the path that did not require me to be brave." He paused. "I said 'I know' because I wanted you to understand that I was not ignorant. I was afraid. That is worse than ignorant." "Yes," he said. She was still holding the rosemary. She looked at it. The herb they had argued about for 7 years, the one she had moved in his garden and been right about, the one that grew in her dispensary beds, now under her own authority. She held it out. Edmund took the other end. They both held it between them. She pulled. He did not let go. She pulled harder. He stepped closer, into the garden, into the last of the amber light, and the rosemary bent between them, but did not break. She let it go. She took his face in both hands, her hands cracked from lye soap, competent from 7 years of healing, and kissed him. Not gently. The kiss of a woman who has waited 7 years and has finished waiting. When they parted, she was still holding his face. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just stopped being afraid and is not yet accustomed to the feeling. "You taste like my tisane," she said. "I drank it before I came." His hands had found her wrists, holding them gently. "For courage. The tisane is for headaches." It worked for both. Agnes lowered her hands. She looked at the garden, the dispensary, the last of the daylight going. "I will not enter Thornridge through the kitchen door again," she said. "If you want me in your house, I walk through the front, in my own clothes, with my own name, as a healer. I would not ask you to be anything else. You asked me to be your quiet companion for 7 years." The blow landed. Edmund absorbed it without flinching, which was itself a kind of answer. "I did," he said, "and you agreed, because you were as afraid as I was, afraid that asking directly might give you a no, and you preferred the uncertainty to the risk." Agnes was quiet. She knew he was right. She had always known it, at the level where knowledge lives before it becomes words. "Come back tomorrow," she said, "through the front door, with your Latin dictionary. I have tincture labels that need correcting, and your handwriting is better than mine. My Latin is better than yours." "Your Latin is adequate," Agnes said. "Not good, adequate. I will improve. You will practice." She picked up her cutting basket. "And Edmund, when Lady Calloway comes to inspect the situation in person, which she will do within the fortnight, I will serve her the rosemary tisane that cured her headaches. She will have to choose between her pride and her comfort. I am betting on the comfort." Edmund looked at her, the woman who had just kissed him in a herb garden after 7 years of silence, and was already planning her tactical approach to his aunt. He laughed. The sound of a man who has stopped carrying the weight of his own rationality. 3 weeks after the herb garden. Morning. Agnes was at the dispensary counter before 8, grinding the comfrey root for Garrick's shoulder. The shoulder had improved considerably, but the cold was settling into it, and he would be in before noon, she knew, because he always was when the temperature dropped. The bell above the front door rang at 9:30. Mrs. Hadley came in with young Thomas, who was holding a handkerchief to his nose with the resigned expression of a child who's been told he is not dying, but does not entirely believe it. Agnes looked up from the mortar. "The cough again?" she asked. "Worse this week," Mrs. Hadley said, settling her basket on the counter. "And now his nose. The honey and thyme syrup, and I'll add a little elderflower for the congestion." Agnes reached for the bottles. "Sit him down. I'll mix it fresh." She was measuring the elderflower when the bell rang again. Edmund came through the front door. The bell above it rang clearly, the same bell that rang for every patient, every delivery, every customer on Church Street. And he walked in with his hat in his hand and his coat carrying the cold of the morning. And he looked at Agnes behind the counter and then at Mrs. Hadley, who had turned to see who had entered. Mrs. Hadley looked at the Duke of Thornridge. She looked at Agnes. She looked at the mortar in Agnes's hand, and the apron she was wearing, and the dispensary ledger open on the counter. "Your Grace," she managed, and curtsied with the automatic precision of a woman who has practiced this gesture, but has never before needed it in an apothecary on Church Street on a Tuesday morning. "Mrs. Hadley." Edmund nodded. "How is Thomas's cough?" "Better, Mrs." Hadley said, still processing the situation. "Miss Whitmore's syrup is working. Miss Whitmore's syrup usually does." Agnes did not look up from the mortar. The poultice for Garrick's shoulder needs 10 more minutes. Sit. A beat of silence. Edmund sat down on the wooden stool beside the counter. In his coat. On an herbalist's stool. In a dispensary on Church Street, in the village, in daylight, where Mrs. Hadley was watching him with her mouth slightly open, and young Thomas had forgotten entirely about his handkerchief. Mrs. Hadley watched this for 3 seconds. She picked up her basket. She paid for the syrup she had not yet received. Agnes wrapped it quickly and handed it across. And she left with her mouth still open and the particular expression of a woman who knows that the village will hear about this before noon, and who intends to be the one who tells it. Agnes set down the pestle. You sat. You told me to sit. Most dukes do not take orders from herbalists. Most herbalists did not save 3 children from scarlet fever last month. He looked at the shelves, the jars, the morning light coming through the front window onto the dispensary floor. Dr. Fenton wrote again. He wants to discuss a formal referral arrangement. Dr. Fenton can discuss a formal arrangement when Dr. Fenton stops calling me the herb girl in his correspondence. He called you the most capable practitioner in Hertfordshire in his second letter. In his second letter, Agnes said. His first called me the herb girl. I have a very good memory. You have a perfect memory, Edmund said. It is one of your less restful qualities. She almost smiled. Not quite, but the architecture of 7 years of professional distance shifted in her face. A door unlatching. Come back this afternoon, she said. I have the new tincture order to label, and your Latin will be useful. Adequate, Edmund said. Adequate, Agnes agreed. But adequate is what I have. Midsummer, the Thornridge estate, but not the ballroom, the kitchen garden, which Agnes had redesigned over the preceding weeks, with the methodical precision of a healer who understands that good medicine begins with good cultivation. Lavender in the south beds, where the light was strongest. Comfrey along the north wall, where it could spread. Sage and thyme in the rows nearest the dispensary door, which opened now onto the village road with its own entrance, separate from the estate's main approach, with a painted sign above the lintel, Whitmore Dispensary. Agnes was pressing the last rosemary into the bed when Edmund arrived with a letter. Dr. Fenton, he said. He is recommending you to the county hospital for consultation cases, formally in writing, with his name attached. Agnes sat back on her heels and looked at the letter. Fenton's handwriting was precise and slightly pompous, which matched the man. She read the relevant sentence twice. He still begins with, the practitioner, she said. Not Miss Whitmore, the practitioner. He ends with, whose competence in fever management exceeds that of most physicians I have consulted in the southern counties, Edmund said. I thought the ending outweighed the beginning. I will consider it. Agnes stood, brushing soil from her apron. The dispensary opens in an hour. I know. I am here to carry the heavier jars. You are here because you like watching me work. Both, Edmund said. Both are true. She looked at him, standing in the medicinal garden she had planted, with Fenton's letter in his hand and soil on his boots from walking across the beds to reach her, which he had done without noticing or caring. She took his hand. Soil on her fingers, ink on his. The marks of 2 different kinds of work, held together in the midsummer light. Walk me through the front door tonight, she said. Thornridge, for dinner. Lady Calloway is coming. Lady Calloway has not confirmed. Lady Calloway is coming, Agnes said, with the certainty of a woman who has been managing difficult cases for 3 years. She wants to assess the situation in person. She will arrive at 7, and she will sit across from me at dinner, and she will have a headache by the second course because she always does when she is concentrating very hard on being disapproving. Agnes picked up her basket. I will serve her the rosemary tisane. She will have to choose between her pride and her comfort. And you are betting on the comfort. I am betting on the comfort, Agnes confirmed. I have been treating her headaches for 4 months. I know which way that calculation goes. Edmund laughed, the easy, unguarded sound of a man who has stopped performing composure, the laugh she had heard only rarely across 7 years, and now heard most mornings when he came through the front door of the dispensary, and sat on the wooden stool and argued with her about Latin labels and the correct dosage of valerian. They walked toward the house together. The dispensary bell would ring in an hour. The front door of Thornridge was ahead of them, wide and well lit in the midsummer afternoon. Agnes walked toward it in her working clothes, with soil on her hands and the smell of rosemary on her fingers. And she did not wipe her hands clean before they reached the door. And Edmund did not ask her to. She walked through the front door of Thornridge for the second time in her life. The first time she had walked out alone, in October, in the dark. This time she walked in daylight, with his hand in hers, and the house was full of light.